Kazakhstan is a diverse multinational society that includes some 160 ethnic groups who speak more than 80 languages. Some of that is due to the fact that it's a giant steppe that's been raided, invaded, passed through and settled multiple times over the last 25 centuries. But a lot of that is due to the period between 1923 and 1961 with the existence of Главное, управление исправительно-трудовых лагерей, or Gulag for short. The chief administration of corrective labor camps, or the Gulag, was the institution running the labor camps, although in English we also refer to individual camps as a Gulag as well. During this period, 40% of the Kazakh people in Kazakhstan either died, most of them, or left for exile. The number of Kazakhs had come down to a bit under 3 million. In their place, millions and millions of Russians, Volga Germans, Greeks, Crimean Tartars, Jews, Poles, Belarussians, Romanians, and a plethora of smaller people groups were resettled here. Resettled. This almost sounds humane. In reality, it was people put into cattle trains like these and forcibly moved here. Many died on the journey, and many more died of the freezing cold here. The USSR set up 11 labor camp systems on the territory of Kazakhstan, but the most famous of them are Alzhir and KarLag. Alzhir is an acronym for Akmolinski Lager Zion Izmenikov Rodina, and this became known for its unique purpose. The acronym in English translates something like Akmolinsk Camp of Wives of Traitors to the Motherland, and as the name suggests, it was a gulag for women whose sole purpose was to torment women who explicitly hadn't broken the law, not even the Stalin-era always changing Soviet law, but their husbands might have. It was located very close to Astana, and it's the reason I had wanted to go to Astana but couldn't, because Kazakh Railways disagreed. The other famous one is KarLag, which is an acronym for Karagansky исправительно-трудовой лагерь, located 35 to 40 kilometers away from the city of Karaganda. The KarLag system of camps is famous because this is where Solzhenitsyn wrote his famous Gulag Archipelago, but it's also famous through its sheer size. At its peak, the KarLag system had a built-up area about the size of the nation of Slovenia, and its surrounding area, used to fuel the labor camps, went on for more than hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. By some accounts, it was as big as France, though some historians dispute that. What nobody disputes is that the core of the KarLag camp system was 21,000 square kilometers, which is in fact bigger than Slovenia. The KarLag camp system at Dolinka is also famous through the sheer numbers. More than 1 million people went through this particular gulag. Waves and waves of prisoners from Soviet Russia were transferred here to mine cheap coal for the Soviet industry. Not much of this remains today. Survivors of the political repression are slowly withering away and dying, and after the abolition of the program, the Soviet authorities just let everything rot and then later on restored the land to mostly civilian circuit. So most of what you see today on the territory of the former KarLag system is regular villages, sometimes built on top of mass graves. Villagers to this day accidentally stumble upon mass graves from NKVD's executions, and not just in KarLag. In the summer of 2020, for instance, the villagers in Zhanalyk, Almaty Oblast, dug up 56 victims of NKVD executions.
А начнем с уникальной находки в Алматинской области. Там обнаружили массовое захоронение расстрелянных, так называемых врагов народа. Наша съемочная группа отправилась на место трагических событий почти вековой давности.
Пенсионер Мурат Байгужаев отчетливо помнит тот день, когда нашел во дворе своего дома человеческие останки. Мужчина рассказывает, копал канал для прокладки труб под водопровод. Примерно на глубине 1,5 метров штык лопаты уперся во что-то твердое.
Кость, челюсть, нижняя, по-моему, скула.
Доподлинно установить личности погибших, объясняют эксперты, вряд ли удастся. Кости и черепа смешались, тем более сохранились лишь фрагментарно. К тому же такая экспертиза обойдется дорого. Но то, что останки принадлежат жертвам политических репрессий 30-х годов, сомнений нет. Один из фактов, который подтверждает это, в каждом черепе пулевые отверстия.
Около 56 человек расстрелянных. Почему расстрелянных? Потому что там полностью факт. Гильзы, патроны и у всех черепа прострелены насквозь.
Только на территории Казахской ССР под различным предлогом было осуждено более 100 тысяч человек. Тогда клеймо «враг народа» ставили без суда и следствия. Приговоры штамповали один за другим. У историков и археологов есть все основания полагать, что село Жаналык было кладбищем жертв сталинского террора.
В годы Большого террора в 1937-1938 годах все репрессированных судили и расстреливали в городе Алматы в подвале НКВД. И вывозили ночью все трупы сюда.
По разным оценкам, в застенках НКВД расстреляли более 25 тысяч казахстанцев. После исполнения приговора тела вывозили за город и сбрасывали в ямы. Вся история той мрачной эпохи хранится в стенах Музея памяти жертв политических репрессий.
About political repression, the hideous face of communism and the systemic destruction of nations, that's what we're going to discuss in this episode. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth installment of the Central Asia featured series. Now, since this episode is perhaps the most depressive of the whole series, allow me to begin with these two wonderful kittens. This blue-eyed fellow was majestically guarding the KarLag museum. During my visit here, a company of the Kazakh military also showed up with new recruits being taken here to learn about the history of their country and thus learn what they're defending. This little fellow had a good day and got pat by dozens of people. Meanwhile, these very fluffy fellows were guarding the Alzhir memorial when another YouTuber went there. I hope the YouTuber Lordegraf forgives me for ripping this footage from their channel. This fluff could not remain unknown. As opposed to Almaty, the rest of Kazakhstan is very kitten-friendly and fluffy fellows are routinely available for a pat. Alright, so in this episode we'll discuss the KarLag Gulag, then the Alzhir women's camp a little bit, and towards the end of the episode we'll get a bit into the present-day consequences of this period. So, in the last episode we left the story of Kazakhstan at the legal formation of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic in the 1930s. The 1930s were a particularly harsh period of time throughout the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Djugashvili, or Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, in ways that, at least in Central Asia, makes World War II in fact a better period. The KarLag camp system at Dolinka was created in 1931 during the period of settlement of remote areas of Greater USSR and its ethnic republics. Cheap labor was in high demand for these purposes, and Stalin simply signed a decree that said more people need to be brought here. So his will was done. People were arrested and transported from west of the Ural Mountains to this gigantic labor camp in central Kazakhstan, spanning from Akmola region in the north to the Chu River in the south. All of this on an already grim background. In the previous episode I mentioned the Asharshiluk, which is effectively the Kazakh Holodomor. In fact, that's how it is called in the museum as well, because Golod in Russian means famine. At least 1.5 million people died in the Kazakh Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic, of whom 1.3 million were ethnic Kazakhs. More than a third of all Kazakhs. And these are the conservative numbers. The fact of the matter is that we don't know how many people perished, not only because generally the Soviet authorities were not great with record keeping, but also because most of this was intentional. The reason so many people were sent here was precisely so they can disappear without many noticing. Out of sight, out of mind. That's really how this policy worked. But before the first people got deported here, the first inmates were locals who disagreed with Stalin's collectivization policy. You see, Stalin ordered the forced collectivization of agriculture throughout the Soviet Union, and in Kazakhstan, the implementation was overseen by this guy, Philip Goloshchokin. He ordered the Kazakhstan's largely nomadic population was to be forced to settle in collective farms. Whoever disagreed, well, best case scenario, they would end up in one of these camps. Philip Goloshchokin had been appointed as the first secretary of the Communist Party in the newly created Kazakh Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic in February 25. From 1925 to 1933, he ran the Kazakh ASSR with virtually no outside interference. So, in other words, local administration had an even higher impact on the evils occurred on these lands than even Stalin did. As I was saying in the previous episode, the Kazakh SSR gets legally created in 1936. Up until then, the Kazakhs were legally Kyrgyz and just a random tribe in Russia proper. The creation of Kazakh SSR was a pale consolation given that by 1936 Kazakhs had become a minority in their own lands and stayed a minority for the next 60 years. In 1937, the first major deportation of an ethnic group in the Soviet Union began with the removal of the Korean population from the Russian Far East to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Over 170,000 people were forcibly relocated throughout that year using 124 trains for the 6,400 kilometers journey. The official reason given was to stem, quote, the infiltration of Japanese espionage into the Far Eastern Krai, unquote. You see, Koreans were at the time subjects of the Empire of Japan, which was the Soviet Union's rival. Estimates based on population statistics suggest that between 16,500 and 50,000 deported Koreans died from starvation, exposure, and difficulties adapting to their new environment in exile. Nobody ever acknowledged this even really happening, let alone apologize or pay reparations. After Nikita Khrushchev became the new Soviet leader in 1953 and purported to undertake a process of de-Stalinization, he condemned Stalin's ethnic deportations but did not mention Soviet Koreans among these exiled nationalities. It's like it never happened. And the official policy remained the same until the last day of existence of the USSR. The exiled Koreans remained living in Central Asia, and those who survived the Stalinist period ended up integrating into the Kazakh or Uzbek society, with the new generations gradually losing their culture and language. But this was just the first big group. A lot more were to follow, and with them, subsequent increases of the KarLag camp system. By the end of it, the system here covered more territory than the modern nation of Slovenia, with the inmates building railroads, housing for livestock, housing for camp employees, barracks, and isolation units. It was essentially a colony with a heavy management apparatus. Its departments included administrative agriculture, planning and control, culture and education, human resources, trade, supply chain, transport, finance, political, medical, and so much more. In KarLag, the inmates' efforts built a meat processing plant and a leather processing plant which produced leather products, furs, and the traditional Russian valenki, which are a form of boots that are not exactly water resistant, but good enough for the heavy winters of Siberia, especially if worn with overshoes. Most of the people that ended up here were on the infamous Article 58 of the Soviet-Russian Penal Code. Article 58 was the one dealing with enemies of the workers, anti-Soviet activity, and generally counter-revolutionary activities. A counter-revolutionary was defined as, quote, any action aimed at overthrowing, undermining, or weakening of the power of workers and peasant Soviets and governments of the USSR and Soviet and autonomous republics, or at the undermining or weakening of the external security of the USSR and main economical, political, and national achievements of the proletarian revolution, unquote. Subsequent paragraphs of it added more things that fell under this article. For example, Article 58-4 mentioned, quote, any kind of help to the international bourgeoisie which, not recognizing the equality of communist political system, strives to overthrow it, unquote. In practicality, this meant anyone the Kremlin didn't like, really. Those that weren't outright executed under supposed Article 58 violations were subjected to long sentences, up to 25 years, and frequently extended indefinitely without trial or consultation. After World War II, Article 58 was extended beyond the USSR's borders too. For instance, in the NKVD special camp in Bautzen, 66% of the inmates were there for Article 58 violations, even though Bautzen is, well, in Germany. To make things worse here, KarLag wardens answered only to the Gulag NKVD bureau in Moscow. No Soviet, state or local government organizations had any influence on the operations of the wardens and supervisors of the KarLag camp system. This, in practicality, meant that no limits existed on the depths of depravity possible here. For instance, during mass execution events, the administration would organize large and loud musical events in order to cover up for the sounds of the bullets, especially when relatively important people were being executed. This was depraved even by Soviet standards, but it happened nonetheless because the wardens thought it's a good idea. A lot of what happened here remained under wraps for decades. The camp system was simply shut down in 1961 and the unoccupied land was simply repurposed for civilian use. Poor villagers from around the area did the rest by dismantling the barracks and using them as firewood or to build their own houses. By 1991, when the USSR fell apart, only this administrative building was still around. A bit later on, it became clear that this house used to be the private residence of the warden, but by that time, this house had become private property and thus can't be visited and remains outside of the research circuit. Nevertheless, both this house and the administrative building were built using slave Gulag labor and remain the last standing elements of what used to be a gigantic camp system. The museum was opened in 2002, but only really became relevant over the last decade or so. Well, actually, there is one other surviving element of the KarLag camp system. It's this place. Officially known as the Monument to KarLag Mass Burials in Spassk. As you can see, it's not a monument, it's a collection of monuments, and Spassk is a village located beyond the military settlement that is on the other side of the road. Today, it's a collection of monuments in the middle of nowhere. But this was at the edge of the KarLag camp systems 70 to 80 years ago, and the surrounded area is, in fact, a mass cemetery. Following the opening up of the country in post-communism, one by one, countries whose citizens were killed in this Gulag sent monuments to commemorate the victims of political repression, as they're known locally. Later on, individual families have also started to build monuments on this mass grave. Just as I was taping this footage, another family from likely Estonia, judging by the language, was visiting this place. They had a very old person with them, likely a relative of one of the many former inmates of this gigantic labor camp system. This place is more for reflection than for tourist purposes, clearly. And boy, what a reflection. You also get to feel the climate of the wider Karagandskaya Oblast. These pictures were taken in late August in one of the few weeks per year when the weather is tolerable. The humid continental climate of this area means 5 months a year the temperature goes below minus 20 degrees Celsius and sometimes below minus 40, and another 3 months a year temperatures vary between minus 15 and minus 3. With the exception of late July, August and the first week of September, abundant snow is also a feature. These are the conditions under which people were put to work in this god-forsaken place. We took a few kilometers back towards the city on foot because the lack of reception meant a taxi couldn't be called, so the best option was to walk to the next village, Zhumabek. Walking next to the road in Kazakhstan is pretty challenging even during the best weeks of the year, like it was when I taped these images. I simply don't know how to express in words just how harsh the climate is here. In fact, after facing the August cold and the harsh wind of Karagandskaya Oblast, it took me less than 1 minute to understand why Moscow chose to put one of its bigger labor camps here. Sure, in part it was motivated by the need of cheap labor to extract the coal, because let us not forget that all this started as a need for slave labor, but making it so big in the end was also because the conditions were particularly harsh even by the standards of the Kazakh SSR. I mean, Kazakhstan has harsh climate in the north, but Karagandskaya Oblast is so particularly cold that is known in the rest of the country too. This place is so remote that it even became an expression in the Russian language itself. If you don't know the answer to where something is, but you are stuck in rather polite company and cannot say something is v pizde, or in the vagina, the polite way of saying that it's in the middle of fucking nowhere is v Karagandie. In fact, there is even this cute monument in the city to commemorate this aspect too. Now, speaking of the city, Karaganda itself is a gulag too, in a way. Obviously no longer today, but almost the entire history of this city is related to slave labor, political repression, and hardline Stalinism. The place got reincorporated in 1931, at the same time with the opening of the KarLag camp system, and became a city in 1934, and although officially not a closed city, or a pochtovny yashik like Silamae, de facto Karaganda was a closed city in all but name only. In the USSR, secret and closed cities, inaccessible even to Soviet citizens, were a thing. On the streets, they were referred to as the mailboxes, because a postal code was the only official acknowledgement of their existence. The city of Silamae, today in Estonia, is one such example. Contemporary Russia still maintains quite a few such places, and Kazakhstan still has a legally closed city, Baikonur, which is related to the Russian problem. More on that maybe in the next episode. So, While Karaganda was technically never a closed city, it was, in practice, as closed as it can get. The biographers of Robert F. Kennedy note that while the USSR allowed them to visit Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzia and Kazakhstan, the second they required to stop here in Karaganda, the generous trip was cut short. The delegation was rerouted through Siberia and then their visa was stopped. Koniec filma, as the Russians would say. Karaganda was also the victim of the largest EMP foisted upon a civilian settlement. It happened in 1962 following a 300 kiloton high-altitude nuclear explosion at an altitude of over 290 kilometers over Zhezkazgan. The explosion was part of a series of Soviet tests, and although Zhezkazgan is over 500 kilometers away from Karaganda, the gamma-ray-produced EMP induced a huge current that ended up setting the local power plant on fire, in addition to overloading lead and steel tape-protected cable connecting Astana and Almaty. But since it happened in Karaganda, that is to say, v pizde, nobody cared. So much so that public knowledge about this incident emerged for the first time in 1992, full 30 years later. The whole city is carefully planned and full Soviet, as its very existence as a big city is 100% connected to the Soviet Union, as is the nearby town Topar. As you can see, these places are slowly being reimagined, or at the very least renovated, but to this day their economy is mostly related to coal, though no longer to slavery, and despite their looks, they're not exactly poor either. The climate remains, though. Most of my stay around these places were in late autumn clothes. While Almaty was boiling at 40 degrees Celsius or more, here I rarely saw the sun and the temperatures never got over 15 degrees Celsius. Heck, when I finally got back to Almaty, the taxi driver asked me where I was coming from, and when I mentioned Karaganda, he instinctively replied, "You crazy? It's cold over there." Yeah, I know, it's cold. But even so, Karaganda today is a cultural center too, although the way it acquired its ethnic diversity is a profoundly tragic one. In contemporaneity, they're trying to make the best out of it. I'll get back to this a bit later. But until then, let's talk a little bit about Alzhir too. So, as I was saying in the intro, Alzhir is the acronym for Akmolinski Lager Zion Izmenikov Rodina, or the Akmolinsk Camp of Wives of Traders to the Motherland. The Soviets had an acronym for everything. The inmates at Alzhir were part of the Chesir category of inmates. Chesir is also an acronym, and it stands for Члены семьи изменника Родины, or members of the family of a traitor of the motherland, which was a category explicitly mentioned in the famous Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code. People from the Chesir category were essentially automatically convicted as part of the policy of kin punishment. At least 20,000 women served time here, of which 8,000 served the full sentence. The prison was shut down in 1953, immediately after Stalin's death. It was reported that 1,507 of the women gave birth as a result of being raped by the guards. The children were given up for adoption. Many of them never met their mothers. A lot of exact numbers are missing because the whole thing was managed under NKVD's secret orders signed by Lavrenti Beria or Stalin himself. Also, some of the children were themselves then rerouted to other labor camps as socially dangerous. Also, while the name of this camp is about wives, this Gulag was your garden variety women's labor camp. Daughters, mothers, sisters, and grandmothers of those deemed enemy of the state were also sent here. It should be noted that Alzhir wasn't the biggest women's gulag. Order 486 of the NKVD instructs to send the wives primarily to Temlag, which was a bigger labor camp on the territory of present-day Russia. Oh, and children over 15 were also liable for at least 5 years in a camp for being a family member of a traitor to the motherland. That's how the USSR worked in practice. What you're looking at now are sequences from the movie made by Kaz Telefilm about the horrors at Alzhir. The movie is available in full on YouTube, but unfortunately no English subtitles are available, and no Russian subtitles either for the portions that are in Kazakh. Most of these crimes remained cloaked in secrecy for decades, and while a lot was disclosed in the 1980s and especially the 1990s, the cloak of secrecy was brought back in 1999 with the rise to power of one particular Chelovek named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Slowly but surely, more and more details were reclassified once again under Putin, while the ex-Soviet countries struggled with the demons left as a Soviet legacy. On October the 25th, 1990, Kazakhstan declared its sovereignty on its territory as a republic within the Soviet Union, and following the August 1991 aborted coup attempt in Moscow, Kazakhstan declared independence on December the 16th, 1991, thus becoming the last Soviet republic to declare independence. 10 days later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Fun fact, the document that gave birth to the successor of post-Soviet organization, known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, was signed in Kazakhstan, and it is known as the Alma-Ata Protocol. Also, Alma-Ata hosted the signing of the first globalist treaty of the World Health Organization in 1978. So Kazakhstan was not just the last Soviet republic to declare independence, but also the place where the post-Soviet structure was also founded. Even after all Russia did to Kazakhstan, there was still enough goodwill to give it another shot. And that goodwill was going to last all the way until 2022, when finally both the leadership and the Kazakh people just ran out of fucks to give about what Russia thinks about anything really. The Gulags left the Kazakh people a minority within their country, and while ethnically they did recover decades later, the Kazakh language is still, to this day, a minority language. Russian continues to be the dominant language in Kazakhstan, both in the cities and in the rural areas. In Karagandskaya Oblast, I don't remember hearing more than 3 sentences in Kazakh, one of which being a babushka chastising a grandson. And this isn't a surprise. The idea in the Soviet Union was that while the nations are somewhat recognized, terms and conditions may apply, the Russian language was to be the language to be used when communicating with other ethnicities or with the state. And with Kazakhstan in general and Karagandskaya Oblast in particular having been made very ethnically diverse through no fault of the non-Kazakhs and through no desire of the locals, it remains a matter of practicality to continue to use the Russian language. And while in other places the newly independent nations found a way to reduce the presence of the Russian language, this remains a difficult and delicate task here. Most of the speakers of Russian in most other Soviet republics were effectively Russian colonists brought here by Moscow to rule over the unruly masses. But in Kazakhstan, most of the speakers of the Russian language were themselves victims of political repression just as much as the Kazakhs. They didn't choose to settle in Karaganda. Someone else, foreign to them too, made that decision for their parents or their grandparents. So, over the last 15 years or so, the Kazakh government started seriously working on the historical memory of political repression, which, in addition to the obvious benefit of not letting atrocities fade away from memory, this also ended up preventing the emergence of at least some ethnic tensions. One of the non-marginal minorities in Kazakhstan is, in fact, Ukrainian, a bit over 2% in the 2021 census. Generally, they do speak some Kazakh, but the escalation of the war by Russia in Ukraine just a month after the Almaty riots in January 2022 also led to an increase of interest in Kazakhstan for the Kazakh language from all of the minorities, and particularly by the Russian minority. A statistic published while I was in the country said that 45% of the residents of Kazakhstan use the Kazakh language at least semi-regularly. So it's a long way to go, but the process is helped by the fact that in post-communism the memory of political repression was cultivated, albeit not exactly by the book. The Gulag past is, in a way, the shared legacy between the citizens of Kazakhstan, and it's a legacy that transcends ethnic and linguistic background. And I suppose that is the silver lining of this tragic chapter in Kazakhstan's history. It cannot be changed, the evil cannot be undone, and the vast majority of the victims of the Gulag are now long dead, so might as well use it for something good. The 20th century has been far from kind to Kazakhstan and to Central Asia in general. In the following episodes, we'll go through the horrors of the neighbors as well, but the 21st century may turn out to be better, provided that the demons of the past are well internalized and understood. Russia continued to treat Kazakhstan as a colonial subject, but lately, over the last year, this has stopped working. While not yet fully on the anti-Russia train, Kazakhstan has been giving the cold shoulder to the Kremlin lately. It banned the export of weapons, it welcomed refugees from Russia itself, beefed up the teaching of Kazakh in schools, stopped the export of steel to Russia, joined various infrastructure initiatives aimed at increasing commerce with Europe, including in the field of energy, all very popular changes. Slowly but surely, things are changing and may end up better this time around. But one thing is certain, the Soviet experience nearly eradicated the nation, so it is no wonder that they're now treading carefully. For many Kazakhs, this is the Renaissance in many ways. So yeah, this is the shortest version of the story of the Gulag in Kazakhstan. So I will end with a quote from Dr. Aymar Ventsel, an Estonian ethnologist who specialized in identity in Kazakhstan, on the remembrance of the Gulag in Kazakhstan. Quote, "As strange as it may be, the weakest link in the whole treatment of the collective commemoration of the Gulag and shared suffering is in fact Kazakhs themselves. Similar to natives of Siberia, Kazakhs stayed outside the system when it came to the prison camps founded on their homeland. The Gulag system was established on Kazakh lands without permission, and Kazakhs were forbidden from living around the prison camps. Even though a small number of Kazakh urban intellectuals who later ended up in the camps existed at the beginning of the Soviet period, most Kazakhs in the 1930s were nomadic cattle herders who later tried to survive a great famine after the Soviet authorities confiscated their cattle in order to force them to settle down. The memoirs of former prisoners published in Estonian reveal that Kazakhs were treated as dirty and uncultured savages not only by the figures of authority, but also by other prisoners. However, Kazakhs have assumed the role of helpers and supporters in the legend of suffering under the Gulag system. The story of how Kazakh children started throwing stones at prisoners passing their village has almost become part of the official record of history. One of the prisoners finally discovers in various ways that the stones are in fact dried curd cheese, which is a traditional Kazakh dish, also spelled as kurt. Having heard different versions of this legend, I asked the local historians about it, and they explained that the large-scale occurrence of the event is highly unlikely, as the camps were surrounded by a 25-kilometer restricted zone from which unauthorized persons were excluded. Despite everything, Kazakhs remain the glue that bind together the stories of different ethnic groups' hardship in the commemoration and remembrance of the suffering under the Gulag, having protected, helped, cured, and fed them all, unquote. This pretty much encapsulates the way current Kazakhstan looks at the Gulag period. In the next episode, we'll cover the onset of the independence movement in the 1980s and deal with the contemporary history of Kazakhstan. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.